Hello everyone, it's Grandpa Hickory from Texas saying hello to all. Now this video is labeled Hobo Beans. Now back in the 1950s, me and my brother went out in the woods a lot. My daddy taught us lessons learned from the Great Depression, and I've got a video on that, and I highly recommend everyone to look at that video and to think about it and to copy it. But my daddy taught us to take a 3-foot, now this was nylon string. In the 1950s, we didn't have monofilament. But we had a long, 3-foot long nylon string, and we had a bobber that had a sharp stick in it. And in the hole, we would put our line through it, and we'd stick the sharp hole of the stick in it. And then down at the bottom, towards the bottom, we would bite the sinkers, which was lead sinker. We'd bite it on, and then at the bottom, we would tie a hook, and our daddy taught us how to do it. Well, you wrap that up around a stick that you find in the woods. You want a fat stick if you can find one. And then you stick the hook in it at the top, and then you put it in your pocket, and you button it down, and you've got that ready. Now, we come upon a lot of ponds, a lot of brooks, a lot of streams. You wouldn't believe the big fat fish that we caught. But I want to talk to you today. Me and my brother crossed a lot of railroad tracks in the 1950s. And we came upon a lot of little hobo camps. Now, they were real friendly people. You would think, nowadays, you're liable to get killed, friends. It's not the same today as it was back then. But we went in there and it smelled so good. And they had these big cast iron pots. And they had these big branches in the ground, and they had another big branch going across the top, and they had this, they called it a cauldron. It was a big cast iron cauldron, and they had put water in it. They got the water from the fresh brook. It's a stream, it's an underwater stream, crystal clear water. You could scoop it up and drink it. Oh, it was so cold and good. We used to do it all the time when I was a lad of a boy. These are the things we did in the 1950s, friend. These kids that sit in front of computers nowadays, they don't have an inkling of an idea of what fun is. But anyway, let me tell you something. We smelt something good and we followed our noses, went into a hobo camp. And they gave us a little tiny bowl of the hobo beans that they had cooked. Now they had, sometimes they would have quail in the pot. They would catch quail and they would clean them. And they'd cut them up and they'd put the pieces of it in with the beans that they had. Now listen, the hobos back in the 1950s, they planted beans, they planted zucchini squash, yellow squash, pinto beans, everything, because see, all them hobos ran those all those steam engine trains that came by. And they planted pinto beans, they planted squash, they planted tomatoes in the woods, friends. And we went out there, we had some of the biggest, fattest, tastiest tomatoes you'd ever taste in your life. And they had salt. We put salt on. They were real friendly. We got to talk to them. They told us about different things, about all the cities they went to. But see, we weren't interested in joining, being a hobo. Hey, come on, We were happy with our dad and with our family. So anyway, we got to enjoy their hobo beans, but they would take hobo beans. Now, let me tell you this now. This is the recipe from the 1950s. They had a huge cauldron simmering, hanging over this fire, and the cauldron would kind of swing with the wind, and they had fire going up, and they would go out in the woods and get branches. They didn't have an axe. Now, they had a hatchet. And they would put and feed that fire up underneath it. And it was bubbling, and they had pinto beans going, and they would go over there after they'd got the quail. Sometimes they'd get a squirrel. Have you ever tasted a squirrel? You say, hey, let me tell you something. We're talking survival here. Listen to Grandpa Hickory, okay? I'm trying to teach you something. This is wisdom. I'm trying to let you know. This is what me and my brother learned. But they would take and clean that squirrel good, and they would tear pieces off of that meat and throw it in there with those beans. And boy, they were bubbling, and oh, listen, it smelled so good. And sometimes they even got a wild pig. Now, I'm talking about a very small wild pig. And they cut it up, and they put that pork off in there. Oh, listen. You say, hey, listen, you wouldn't believe the smell. It smelled so good. And they would stir it with a big branch about it's about 2 feet long. And it was about that big around that they got from the woods. And they would whittle it down to where the bark wouldn't fall off in the beans. And they would take that over and swish it in the water of that running brook. Now, some people call it a running stream. It's crystal clear water. You can scoop it up and drink it and not get sick. I mean, it is spring water, people. We called it a brook, me and my brother did. But anyway, they would wash that off good, and then they'd go over there and they would stir that. Well, the other hobos coming in, they would go over there. Some of them even had bacon. Now, the hobos back in the 1950s, they would go up and knock on people's doors. My mother even did it when I was a lad of a boy. And they would ask for a sandwich. My mother would make them sandwiches out of tuna fish or peanut butter and jelly, or even from a meatloaf that we had left over from the night before. And she'd put potatoes on them, and she'd squash her bread down on them and gave them to them. We didn't have baggies back then. Did you hear me? We didn't have baggies in the 1950s. We had wax paper. And my mother would wrap them up in wax paper and give them to the hobos that come up and knocked on the back door. They were very friendly people. And listen, they'd come up without us even asking them. They did yard work on our yard. They'd work in our garden. They cultivated it. They would scratch around the bottoms of plants. And my daddy taught us from the Great Depression lessons that he had learned. He taught us how to take around each plant that you got in your garden. This is wisdom. Listen to me. And you would dig down in the ground with like a big fork, and then you would pull it back, and you would knead that ground real good around that plant. Then you'd scoop it back in. Oh, friends, you talk about some of the biggest tomatoes, some of the biggest, juiciest plants. I can't even begin to tell you the vegetables we got. But back to the hobo beans. They were simmering, and me and my brother followed our nose to the woods, and we came in and said hello to them. They'd sit down, and they'd tell us stories about the places they had been. And me and my brother had never been to Boston, and they told us about something that we had never heard of. They called it clam chowder. And they said you could go in, back then you could go into Boston and buy a big, huge bowl of clam chowder, handmade, for 25 cents. It cost a quarter. Now, the hobos, they would go around areas like drive-in movies. We used to have these big drive-in movies. And they would go out there and they'd look on the ground and they would find quarters, dimes, 50 pieces, 50-cent pieces, nickels, pennies, dimes, quarters, and even dollars, silver dollars. And they would buy bacon, and some of them even bought chicken, came in with some chickens. And we had a wonderful time. We really did. Me and my brother, we ate with the hobos, and we sat there and talked with them. But those hobo beans are delicious. And you can make them, you put them in a pot like you take pinto beans, rinse them real good, go through, get all the rocks and dirt out of them. You put them in a nice pot. And what you do is, I was going to show you a pot, but I can't reach it from here. But any road, they would put all that in there, and they get that delicious spring water, cool, ice-cold water, and pour it into that cauldron, that big, round, black cauldron that was up underneath that, swinging over them flames that were licking the bottom of it. Friends, you talk about some of the best beans I've ever had in my life. It had chicken in it. It had quail in it. It had squirrel in it. And some of them even had rabbit in it, and I love rabbit meat. Listen, if I had my way, I would rather eat rabbit meat than anything else. I sure am glad to see that sun shining here in Texas. It just broke through the clouds. Thank you, Jesus. Friends, it's been so cold here, I'm ready for this ice and snow to melt. But this was hobo beans back in the 1950s that me and my brother learned about and how to make. Friends, those were the most delicious beans I have ever eaten in my life. And they had so much protein. Some of them had chicken, quail, squirrel, rabbit, and some of them even had venison. Oh, it was so good, people. But that's Hobo Beans. Hit the like button, subscribe to my channel. I'm Grandpa Hickory, and I'll see you on the next video. Bye for now.